Okay, so in this video, we're going to look at how to make an object spawn at random positions along the bottom of the screen and then travel up along the screen. We're looking at this because a viewer asked me to demonstrate how to do this. We are doing this in the 2D environment, and really all you need to make this work is you need an image, and then you're going to use the code in which I'm about to present. Now, from a high level, basically what you're doing is you're going to use a randomized statement. So it's an RNG, a random number generator. That number that gets randomly generated is going to be used for the X location of the object that gets spawned. So by default, left to right is the X axis. So over here is lower, over here is higher. By default, the middle right here is 0. I'll probably slide this over a little bit, and I'll explain why in a minute. So from a high level, that's all we're doing. We're taking a randomized number and using that number as the X location for the object that gets spawned. And then there'll be a second routine, which is then going to be used to make the object travel up along the screen. So first, we need the object that is going to be spawned, or the technical term that we use is instantiate. So let's go ahead and go to Game Object, 2D Object, Sprite, and we're just going to rename this. We'll call this B. And when we click on B, you can see over in the inspector what components there are. There's the transform component, which gives it position, rotation, scale. This is what I was talking about. This is the number that's going to be randomized. That way, when it gets spawned in different locations. Sprite renderer, well, we'll just take our image, put it right there, and that's our B. And then what we're going to add is we're going to add a rigid body. The rigid body allows for the application of physics. Now what we're going to do in this case, we're going to do add component. We're going to do physics 2D, since we're in the 2D version, and we do rigid body 2D. We're going to not use gravity. Right now, gravity scale is 1. Change that to 0, because we're not going to use gravity. In fact, we want them to do the exact opposite. We want them to travel up along the screen. Now, whenever you're going to be spawning an object, typically what you're going to do is you're going to create what's known as a prefab. All a prefab is a game object that you've created, and then you go from here and you drag it down here. And the reason for that is all these components get saved. So we take the B, we drag it down here, and if you click on the original B, all it is an image. It just gives you the image attributes. This, it has that image, it has that image here, but then all these other components as well. Okay? So we've already done half of what needs to be done. We've created our prefab. So let's go ahead and delete the B that is in the scene. And remember, just delete the one in the scene, not the one down here. We need this image because this object is actively referencing this image. So now let's look at the code that's going to be used to make this happen. We're going to use, it's going to be basically an empty object, and we're going to call it GM, short for Game Master. And it's important to note that Game Master objects, there's absolutely nothing special about them. GM means absolutely nothing to Unity. Calling it GM is a way of self-documenting that you, the designer, knows what this object does. Oh, it's the GM object, that's what it does. Because trust me, as projects get bigger and bigger and bigger, you're really going to want to know as quick as possible what an object does. So we're going to create our GM object. So game object, create empty. And we're just going to call this GM. And again, that's calling it that is purely for your benefit, the designer. So the GM object needs to be made aware of this object. It needs to know that it's here, and then that way it can do things with it. So let's go ahead and create our script. So let's right-click down here, choose Create, C#, and we'll call this game flow. And then what we'll do is we'll click on our GM object, drag and drop the script onto it, and then we will open that script. Okay, so first we're going to make a variable that is going to be used to store the random number. So let's call this, so public, it will be an int, and it will be spawn x, so the x location for the spawn, and it'll start at 0, just to give it default value. This, when you see that double /, that's a remark statement, which means this doesn't actually do anything. It's just purely internal documentation. This simply says that this section occurs at initialization. So we can get rid of that. This likewise tells you that this section occurs every single frame, once per frame. So what we're going to do is in the update section, first we're just going to do the random number generating before applying it to anything, because you always want to test to see if a base functionality is working before you start basing too much on it. So spawn x equals random dot range, and then you put in the range. We're going to say 1, 10. Now, according to them, and you can even see in the pop-up here, returns a random float number between min inclusive and max inclusive, which means that these numbers are also included in the range. So in other words, it's not returning 2 through 9, it's returning 1 through 10. But guess what? Despite what this says, I have never, ever once seen this upper number be included. So even though it says inclusive, it's not. So I won't say anything more about that. Just keep that in mind, that if you actually want this top number to be used, to the best of my knowledge, that either it's a bug or this is wrong. But the bottom line is I never, ever see that upper number be included. And now what we're going to do is debug.log. This is purely, as the name would suggest, a test. We just want to see what values are being returned. In other words, you want to make sure this is working as intended. So we'll save that. Go back to Unity. And we already attached the script to the object. So what's going to happen is down here, you're going to see numbers, and that's all it's supposed to do. And we'll let that run for a few seconds. Okay. Now we'll click on console to see the history, and we just want to look to see that numbers 1 through 10 are indeed being chosen. This is just a timestamp. I'm not quite sure when they started to add that, but it adds a timestamp for when it happened. So 172841871. And like I said, what do you not see here? You don't see 10. So even though the instructions say that the upper number is inclusive, I have never once seen the upper number appear. Now, in this particular example, really don't care that much. It's just that for your own knowledge, that if you're trying to, if you're creating a range and you need that upper number, you're going to have to bump it up by 1. Okay, so we have our random number. So now we need to do something with it. Well, we said that we needed the GM object to be aware of the prefab, the B. So let's do public, and we'll do transform, and it will be, we'll call it B enemy and we'll save that. Go back to Unity, and when you have this object selected, in the game flow, the script section, be enemy. There you go. It's looking for that object. You just grab it, drag it, and drop it. And while it might not be the best way to say it, as I mentioned before, basically what you're doing is you're making this object aware of this object. Close enough, because that's what you're doing, because the GM object can now do things with this object, such as instantiate it. So we're actually already close to being done with the basic request. So what are we going to do? We are going to now, we can either get rid of this or remark it out. Like I said, the / turns it into remark. And now we're going to instead instantiate. Now, because this happens every single frame, probably don't want it to instantiate every single frame, because if this is running 60 frames per second, then you're getting 60 enemies spawned. So, and that also creates inconsistent difficulty. You could lower the frame rate, just have less enemies. So you got to be very careful about what you tie to frame rate. So what you can instead do is you can have a timer in here, and then after a certain amount of time passes, then the enemy spawns. Likewise, you can create a coroutine that is specifically based on time. So got a couple different ways to do it. So let's use the coroutine. So what we're going to do is outside of start, outside of update, so you have to make sure you're not within the squiggly parentheses. Makes it a little bit easier to do it this way. You can see where they match. So we're going to do IE numerator, and we're going to call it, let's say, spawn delay, and then parentheses, squigglies. So we need this to happen, okay? So for one thing, we need to call it, but we haven't finished designing it yet, so we'll do that first. So yield, return, new. Don't worry too much about what that means, because really what you're doing with this line is this. You're telling it to wait a certain amount of time. And the time is 1 second. So it waits 1 second, and then it's going to do something. What is it going to do? It's going to instantiate. So again, when you think of the term spawn, think instantiate. So first you have to say what you're going to instantiate. We're going to instantiate this. So instantiate be enemy. Then you have to say where it's going to be instantiated. So it's a vector 3 because, as I said, there's an X, a Y, and a Z. Actually, sorry, 2D, vector 2. My apologies. I haven't done a 2D in a while. So just X and Y ignores Z. So new vector. We said it's going to spawn at spawn X location. And for as Y, we want it to be at the bottom of the screen. I believe the bottom of the screen is something like -5 to begin with. So even though it's got parentheses and stuff and spaces and commas, ultimately this is one argument. So this is what's being spawned. This is where it's being spawned. And then you have to do a rotation. So we'll use be enemy dot rotation. So in other words, use its own rotation, because you might not. You may, if the bee is spawned at the top of the screen and you want it to come down, you're probably going to rotate it 180 so it's facing down. So again, it's really 3 arguments. What is being spawned, where it's being spawned, and the rotation of what is being spawned. Okay, So now what we're going to do is we need the system to run this, but not keep running it over and over again. So we want to make sure that it's only doing it once per second. So what we're going to do, create one more variable, public, and we'll just do a string, and we'll call it spawning, and we'll set it to no. Actually, we'll start to no. And I'll explain in a bit why I use a string instead of a Boolean if I'm just doing yes and no. I'll explain that in a minute. I just don't want to confuse what we're doing here. So what we're going to do is we then check in the update section if spawning equals, you got to do a double equal sign. So equals n. Then we want something to happen. More squiggly brackets. So if spawning equals to n, then we want to start coroutine, and it's spawn delay. So parenthesis, spawn delay, and more parentheses. So in other words, semicolon at the end. What you're doing is you're taking this entire thing and put it into another set of parentheses. So spawn delay parentheses inside of parentheses. Okay, so the application starts. A random number is generated. If spawn is equal to n, and it starts off as n, then we want this coroutine to run. But we're also saying wait 1 second before anything happens. So we don't want to keep going to spawn delay. So what we also do is we say spawning is now equal to yes. In other words, the word spawning means nothing to the system. It's what you, the designer, need to know. And you need to know that currently, yes, it is in the process of spawning an enemy. So it's going to wait 1 second because we said we're going to run the coroutine. So the coroutine says, wait a second, literally, and then spawn. Well, if it's been spawned, we then want spawning to go back to no. That way, this then knows to spawn again. And if I haven't forgotten anything, that should do it. So we didn't get any error messages. And so what's going to happen is they're just going to spawn at -5. Okay, so -5 is a little bit off the screen. Oh, that's right. I didn't slide the camera over too. I said I was going to slide it over to the right a bit. So let's do that. Okay, but it was working. You could indeed see the enemies were spawning. So let's do a couple more things. Let's slide the camera over. So we go to main camera, and we'll move the X position over 4, because that was the center point. Now it's pushed over. And like I said, the only reason why we're doing that is so we're using whole numbers. Better. Okay. So that's actually a really large chunk of what we wanted to do. We wanted the enemy to spawn, and then we want it to move towards the top of the screen, which we'll do now. However, you probably don't want the enemy to just appear like that. You probably want it to appear off screen. But the reason why I did that is so you could confirm if we had spawning off screen, we couldn't tell if it was working. So for the purposes of troubleshooting, we had it spawn on the screen. So what we do is we go back to our script. And as we said, this is the Y location. So this is the vertical location. So we can just change that to -6. So as you go up, these are positive. As you go down, it gets lower and becomes negative. So we just had it spawn at a slightly lower vertical position. Now, all right, that should do it for the coding. I believe that what we can do now is at the very beginning, I said for the prefab to set gravity scale to 0. But if we set it to -1, then I believe that will make it travel upwards. If not, it's easy enough to do it via scripting. There we go. So I think that brings us to about where we wanted to be. I wasn't certain what the requester was going to use this for. He simply said, can you have objects spawn at random locations at the bottom of the screen and travel upwards? So I don't know if he wants to do like a kind of an in-game cinematic where maybe you have planes taking off, or if he's actually looking to do a enemy wave spawn, as I'm suggesting in the title of this video. But I think that should about do it. And you certainly can apply this to other things as well in other directions. Again, like I said, you could have them spawn at the top and travel down. You could just use positive gravity instead of negative. You could have things spawn on the left and go right. In that case, you would actually have to do a little bit more code that accesses the rigid body and adds velocity. So basically, rather than doing gravity -1 or gravity +1, gravity would be 0, and along the x-axis, you would add velocity to the x-axis. But so I'll add that if you guys want to see it. If you do, just do a like for the video and let me know in the comments if you want to see that, or if you want to see anything else with this. So that should about do it, and I hope everyone found this helpful.